Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckisphere, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Becky, and every Monday and Thursday, with some extra bonus videos sprinkled in, we talk about everything relating to the climate crisis. The problems, yes, but the solutions, yes. If this sounds like something you might be interested in, then please hit that subscribe button below and click the like. Also, feel free to check me out on my social medias. Everything will be linked below. And today we are actually going to talk about the history of how we know that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it. So let's get right into it. All right, so we are actually going to start by just saying that ancient Greeks knew that there was a chance that humans might be able to impact the climate. In fact, there were plenty of examples in ancient history of humans changing a small amount of the environment and it drastically kicking them back for it by massive changes in regional climate. So that idea was not necessarily new. In fact, the famed Aristotle and his pupil, whose name I am going to thoroughly butcher, Theophractus, nope, I say that every time, Theophrastus, his name is Theo. Aristotle and Theo figured that something such as deforestation could actually heat up the area that was deforested and make it a warmer climate. So that idea was already kind of represented in the very early literature in ancient Greece. So, but there was, of course, not really any formal evidence to prove that that was true other than anecdotal evidence, and so now we move on to the early 1800s where a lot of the stuff takes place. A lot of the stuff being a lot of the research that got us to where we are today in our understanding. So we're going to now go in our little time machines. Yes, I got this idea from Cindy Black. Originally, I was going to do a story time where I was going to draw because I ain't doing makeup in front of the camera because nobody wants to see that. But I don't know how people multitask. Like, how do you do your makeup and talk about stuff? Like, I'll be honest, I don't know. It just might be beyond my ability at this point. Anyways, as I was saying, we are going to head on over to 1815 in France. So strap on in, let's go. Okay, here we are. It is 1815 and we are hiking the Vas de Begas. I don't speak French. The Vas de Begas with Jean-Pierre Perraudin. And he was looking around at all these random boulders that were just kind of like seemingly placed in weird areas around the valley. And it just seemed strange. Like, how did these random boulders get there? In addition to that, there was an interesting sort of scraping formation in the ground in that area. And so he came up with the idea that maybe in France a long time ago, there used to be glaciers that bulldozed over the land and then was able to pick up these boulders and put them in random locations when they moved on or they melted or whatever. And so he thought that possibly Europe used to be covered by glaciers. Now that idea was not picked up by a lot of his colleagues, but it only takes one colleague to get interested in the idea, and that one was by the name of Louis Agassiz. Louis Agassiz. And he continued to further the idea to the actual term Ice Age. So he proposed that at one point, parts of Europe and North America were covered in ice. And that was a crazy idea, but it suggested that maybe the current climate that the world or that humanity developed in was not always how the earth used to look. So that kind of left the door open for possible ideas that maybe the current climate that we know is not as stable as we initially thought. So again, we are only in the early 1800s, we are in France right now, and we are going to continue in France because for some reason a lot of the people that came up with this stuff was in French. Interesting, because, you know, Paris Climate Accord, France. You French people, good job. Okay, so after Louis Agassiz came up with the term Ice Age and came up with the idea that different ice ages used to occur over the period of Earth's history, then came Joseph Fourier. And Joseph Fourier kind of went on a slightly different tangent, but also a super important one, that would eventually collide with the idea of Louis' ice ages. And his idea was that the atmosphere actually kept the Earth warmer than it would be if it wasn't there. And that was a really interesting idea because that proposed that this very thin layer of gases actually made the difference between whether or not life was possible on Earth. And he actually went a step further by then equating or comparing the Earth, this giant planet, to that of a greenhouse, where in the case of a greenhouse, you have that thin layer of glass that keeps all the heat in from the sun. But on Earth, the gases, certain gases were acting that same way, where they would trap heat in from the sun and keep the planet warm. So there had to be some system where it would keep certain heat in, but it would also let some heat out, otherwise we would be more like Venus. So that was a really interesting idea that he came up with. And he considered the gases causing this greenhouse effect greenhouse gases. He also suspected that humans might be capable of altering those gases. And he even had a quote that went as so: "The establishment and progress of human societies, the action of natural forces can notably change, and in vast regions, the state of the surface, the distribution of water, and the great movements of air. Such effects are able to make to vary in the course of many centuries the average degree of heat, because the analytic expression contain coefficients relating to the state of the surface and which greatly influence the temperature." Again, this was still only in the early 1800s. One, smart dude, and two, we've known that it's possible for humanity to impact this very delicate system for a long time. But let's keep going. Claude Pouillet came up with the idea that some of the greenhouse gases that were referred to by Fourier were carbon dioxide and water vapor. And so that was what he speculated could be the greenhouse gases. By this point, it was all idea, it was all conjecture, but there wasn't really any formal experimental proof to these claims. Well, then an amateur female scientist named Eunice Foote, she lived in New York, so not France. So she actually was the first in history that we know of to experimentally prove that greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and water vapor was able to trap in heat. She was able to prove that greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and water vapor were able to trap in heat from the sun and keep the warmth in. And how she came up with it was actually a pretty simple experiment. She took 2 vials out into the sunshine. One vial had carbon dioxide in it and the other one had moist air or water vapor in it. And she left those 2 out in the sunshine. Then when she went back later, she tested those 2 temperatures inside the inside the vials and compared it to the dry air outside. And she found that, in fact, both water vapor and carbon dioxide kept in the heat from the sun, causing the temperature in those vials to be warmer than the dry air outside. In addition to that, she also found that carbon dioxide not only kept in the heat, but continued to warm the vial even after she had taken the vials out from the sun. Wow, that was a huge breakthrough. But unfortunately, because one, she was a woman, two, she was in the wrong part of the world because it was really mostly looked at in Europe right now. The climate science overall was developing in Europe. And three, she was considered an amateur scientist. So her work overall was very underrepresented and kind of just left to the wayside. She had some publications and stuff, but not very many people took her work seriously. And only 3 years later, a British man was able to kind of overshadow her work by coming up with the same conclusion. His name was John Tyndall. It's a little unsure whether or not he knew of her research before, because he didn't credit her at all in his paper. But because he was in Europe and she was in the US, there was a possibility that he had never even heard of her research, or because of what the sexism world looked like in the 1800s, he might not have found it relevant. But he did come up with the same conclusion, that carbon dioxide and water vapor, and he also was able to conclude that methane were all greenhouse gases. And he actually took it one step further, because he, instead of just leaving it out in the sun, was able to show that the heat that was being trapped in was really through infrared radiation, was the light that was being trapped in, not necessarily the visible light, which Eunice had predicted. So she thought that it was the visible sunlight that was warming the vials and had been trapped in by those gases. But Tyndall discovered that in fact it was the infrared radiation, so it wasn't the visible light that we could see, it was a different light that was coming in from the sun and then getting trapped by those gases. Now, even though Eunice wasn't completely right on her hypothesis, she was still able to come to the conclusion that, and she has a quote, so I'll read that quote there, "An atmosphere of that gas would give our Earth a high temperature." Smart cookie. That was in the early 1800s, or actually I guess it was the mid 1800s by that point. So it was in the mid 1800s, and from there we move on to 1895. Savant Arrhenius proposed the idea that past ice ages were caused by a change in the carbon dioxide, and that's why those past ice ages, you know, the ones that Jean-Pierre, in the beginning of this story, kind of figured out, as well as then Louis Agassiz? What did I say? Louis. As well, Louis came up with the idea of the Ice Age. Well, now it's coming all the way back in the late 1800s. So Savant came up with the idea that, in fact, the ice ages in the past were due to a change in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he came up with many reasons of why this might be the case, such as volcanic eruptions, which generally release more CO2, or changes in certain environments where CO2 would then be released. Sounds similar to what's going on right now. Yeah. In addition to that, he also calculated that if the carbon dioxide amount in the atmosphere was cut in half, then it would actually decrease, he predicted that it would decrease the overall Earth temperature by 5 degrees Celsius, which is about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. He also checked to see if you doubled the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere whether or not it would increase the Earth's overall temperature by that same amount, and he found from his calculations that that would be the case, that if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was doubled, then we would actually see a 5 degrees Celsius warming of the overall planet. So now we are finally out of the 1800s. So all of this was figured out in the 1800s, and then things kind of stalled. It kind of slowed down in research until about the 1930s, which was also happened to be around the same time where the US Midwest was conducting its own accidental experiment via the Great Dust Bowl by completely stripping soil of its overall nutrient value and resulting in crops not being able to grow there and soil not being able to clump together, resulting in the Dust Bowl. But anyways, so that's a side note. But in the 1930s in Britain, this man by the name of Stewart Callendar came to the realization that, in fact, Earth had already begun warming since the Industrial Revolution. Now, to give some context to the Industrial Revolution, it started in Europe and the US in 1760. So it was before all that stuff in the 1800s that I mentioned happened. So the Industrial Revolution happened. We came up with all these realizations that if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that it would warm the planet. And then by 1930s, we were able to actually see, even though the Industrial Revolution came to a close around either 1820 or 1840, depends on when you look at it, we were able to come to the conclusion, we being, I guess in the case of Callendar, came to the conclusion that the Earth had actually already begun warming due to the influx of CO2 from the Industrial Revolution. So we were actually starting to see that this progress was happening. Then, even though that conclusion happened, it kind of still stalled in the way of climate research. Like, they were like, cool, that happens, moving on. Until 1958, when US scientist by the name of Charles Keeling was actually able to prove that this was happening. He, through the growing technology of computer modeling, was able to show that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has actually increased over time. And he graphed this in the famous Keeling curve.
So back in the late 1950s, my father, Dave Keeling, was asked to make measurements of carbon dioxide at various places around the world. And among the places of great interest was near the top of Mauna Loa, where you had access to very clean air. And an analyzer was installed, and it showed, even within 1 year, it showed this amazing cycle. And that related to the growth and of land plants in the summertime and the sort of release of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere at the other times of year. But over years, it basically increased over time, and it documented as well as any record we have the human impact on the planet through rising carbon dioxide.
As soon as he published his research, a lot of other institutions from around the world developed similar studies, and almost all of them came to the same conclusion, surprisingly very similar to the exact thing that he came up with, which was that if we kept going in our current trajectory, then by the end of the century, we would see a 3-degree warming Celsius in the Earth's temperature. 1958. So what happened? Because those were some of the major breakthroughs that we made. After 1958, there was a lot of other research that kind of talked about what would happen when the Earth warmed, such as rising sea levels and positive feedback loops, which would result in increased amount of carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere. We have started to see more research and also just more proof that this stuff is happening. But why did we not act on it in the 1960s when we knew that it was happening? Well, that will lead me to next week's, because next week we are going to talk about how major fossil fuel industries actually did a really good job of conducting their own research, coming to the same conclusion that Keeling did, and then proceeding to cover it up. Arguably the biggest conspiracy theory that actually did happen. And with that, that is my video for today. If you found it interesting, please comment, like, subscribe, and I will be here next Monday. Well, first I'll be here on Thursday because we have our usual climate book club, information in the description below. But I hope you found this video interesting to kind of give you some more information on how we came to the conclusion that we did. If there's anything that I missed, please go ahead and comment below, and I will see y'all next time in the Beckisphere. Talk to you later. Bye.